Welcome to True Crime Hidden Files. Today's story takes us to Mesa, Arizona, where a family bond turned fatal. This is the case of Margaret Randall, a beloved grandmother, and her troubled grandson, Christian Randall, an 18-year-old whose inner turmoil led to a tragic and unexpected crime. Margaret Randall, 70, was a pillar of her community, respected, admired, and known for her charitable work and kindness. She had been a widow for over a decade, spending her time tending to her garden and dedicating herself to local causes. Despite the loss of her husband, Margaret had built a life of peace and fulfillment, becoming a comforting figure in the lives of those around her. Her most important role, however, was within her own family, especially toward her grandson, Christian. Christian had moved in with his grandmother a year earlier. His life had been upended by his parents' contentious divorce, a long and bitter process that left him emotionally adrift. Margaret had opened her home to him, hoping to provide stability in a time of chaos. What seemed like a loving and supportive gesture, however, was about to take a dark turn. At 18, Christian was deeply troubled. He had always been a quiet and withdrawn child, but the strain of his parents' separation had worsened his emotional state. Isolated and increasingly disconnected from the outside world, Christian found in his grandmother a sense of safety that he could not find elsewhere. To him, Margaret was more than a grandmother, she was his protector, the one constant in his life. But as his dependence on her grew, so did his internal struggles. Margaret, ever patient and nurturing, was unaware of the storm brewing inside Christian. Christian's love for his grandmother was becoming something much more complicated. His emotions, once rooted in gratitude and affection, began to warp under the weight of his unresolved psychological issues. As time passed, neighbors like Sarah Coleman began to notice Christian's increasing detachment from the world outside. He rarely left the house and seemed to have little interest in interacting with anyone other than Margaret. His fixation on his grandmother became more pronounced, and what had once appeared as a close family relationship started to look more unsettling. Margaret did not recognize the dangerous shift happening in her grandson's mind. She continued her daily routines, unaware that Christian's internal turmoil was intensifying. The small, subtle signs of Christian's mental instability, his long periods of isolation, his obsessive attention to her every move, went unnoticed, even as they became more frequent in the weeks leading up to her death. Then, one quiet morning, everything changed. Margaret Randall was found dead in her home, drowned in her bathtub, with the water still running. Christian, the only other person in the house, had discovered her body, but inexplicably delayed calling 911 for several hours. When Officer Kyle Brennan arrived on the scene, he immediately noted the disorder in the house. Furniture had been moved, and objects were scattered throughout. The initial assumption that Margaret's death had been a tragic accident was quickly overshadowed by growing suspicions. Detective Amanda Wallace was soon assigned to the case, and her sharp instincts told her that something far more sinister was at play. As she and forensic expert Dr. James Rowan began to examine the evidence, it became clear that Margaret's death had not been accidental. The signs of a struggle, combined with the inconsistencies in Christian's behavior and the evidence found at the scene, pointed toward a chilling possibility that Margaret's life had ended violently, and the answers to what really happened lay within the complex and troubled mind of her grandson, Christian. The morning of Margaret Randall's death would forever mark a turning point in the quiet Mesa neighborhood. Officer Kyle Brennan was the first to respond to the delayed 911 call. The report had come from Christian Randall, a call filled with anxiety, confusion, and an eerie sense of detachment. Brennan arrived at the scene expecting a simple case of accidental drowning, but what he found immediately raised suspicions. The Randall home, once known for its tidy appearance and calm atmosphere, was in a state of disarray. Furniture had been moved, personal items scattered across the floor, and an air of something unsettling hummed in the air. Upon entering the bathroom, Brennan was met with the sight of Margaret's lifeless body submerged in the tub, the water still running. The death appeared peaceful at first glance, but the disorganized state of the rest of the house didn't sit well with Brennan. Something wasn't adding up. Christian, found pacing in the hallway, was visibly shaken but oddly calm. His clothes were rumpled, his hands fidgeting constantly. Brennan's initial questions about what had happened were met with vague, inconsistent answers. Christian mumbled something about finding his grandmother that morning, but his story lacked clarity. When Brennan learned that Christian had waited several hours before making the 911 call, a knot of suspicion began to tighten in his gut. Why had Christian hesitated? What had he been doing all that time? After securing the scene, Brennan called for backup, ensuring the house was cordoned off for further investigation. Margaret's death was no longer viewed as an accident, but as a potential crime scene. Detective Amanda Wallace arrived not long after, her sharp mind immediately recognizing the inconsistencies in the case. She spoke briefly with Officer Brennan, who filled her in on the delayed call and the chaotic state of the house. Her attention quickly shifted to Christian, whose presence at the scene and erratic behavior demanded closer scrutiny. Christian, however, was in no state to offer coherent answers. His responses to basic questions were fragmented, shifting between confusion and moments of unnerving silence. Wallace knew that any interrogation would need to wait. Christian's mental state needed to be properly evaluated before she could proceed. As forensic expert Dr. James Rowan began his examination of Margaret's body, several things stood out. The most concerning was the bruising on her arms, subtle but telling, indicating that she may have been restrained or struggled before her death. The waterlogged state of her skin made it difficult to determine an exact time of death, but Rowan estimated that Margaret had been in the tub for at least 6 hours, possibly more. There were no immediate signs of a violent struggle in the bathroom, but the condition of the house suggested otherwise. Further examination of the living room, kitchen, and hallway uncovered additional clues. There were scuff marks on the floor, as if furniture had been moved or pushed in haste. A broken picture frame lay on the floor near the doorway, its glass shattered. A prescription bottle of Christian's medication, an antipsychotic, was found on the kitchen counter, the cap still off and several pills scattered nearby. The scene told a story of chaos, but not one that Wallace could piece together just yet. With the evidence gathered, Detective Wallace's next step was to understand the relationship between Christian and Margaret. She began with the neighbors, hoping to glean insights into the household dynamic in the weeks leading up to Margaret's death. Sarah Coleman, Margaret's next-door neighbor, had known the family for years. When Wallace knocked on her door, Sarah welcomed her in, already aware of the tragedy that had unfolded just hours earlier. Sarah spoke of Margaret with fondness, describing her as a generous, loving woman who had always been there for her family and community. But when the conversation shifted to Christian, Sarah's tone changed. She mentioned that Christian had always been a bit off, especially since moving in with his grandmother. Over the past few months, Sarah had noticed Christian's increasing isolation. He rarely left the house, and when he did, he appeared distant, often muttering to himself. His fixation on Margaret had become noticeable too. He seemed to shadow her every move.
What worried me,
Sarah confided,
was how possessive he became. He never left her side. And if she talked to anyone, even me, he'd get this look on his face, like he couldn't stand it.
Sarah's testimony only deepened Wallace's suspicions. It was clear that Christian's attachment to his grandmother had grown unhealthy, even obsessive. But what exactly had driven him to this point? Wallace had to consider whether Christian's mental state, combined with his intense dependence on Margaret, had culminated in something far darker than a mere accident. Next, Wallace turned her attention to Christian's parents. Although they were not present at the time of Margaret's death, their strained relationship with Christian provided key context for his emotional state. His parents had gone through a bitter and protracted divorce, one that had left Christian caught in the middle. His mother, Sarah Randall, described Christian as a sensitive child who had never adjusted well to the separation.
He felt abandoned,
she admitted.
And I think that's when things started to go wrong.
His father, David Randall, was more blunt. Christian's always had issues, he said. We tried getting him help, therapy, medication, but nothing seemed to stick. After the divorce, he just shut down. And moving in with Mom, I thought it would help him. But maybe it just made things worse. As Wallace interviewed Christian's parents, it became clear that Christian's mental health had been deteriorating for years. His diagnosis of a personality disorder, coupled with his refusal to consistently take his medication, painted a troubling picture. The medication bottle found at the scene raised even more questions. Had Christian stopped taking his medication in the days leading up to Margaret's death? And if so, had his deteriorating mental state pushed him to commit an unspeakable act? As the investigation progressed, Wallace and her team began piecing together a timeline of events leading up to Margaret's death. Christian's erratic behavior was well documented, but the question of what exactly had happened in the hours before Margaret died remained unanswered. The forensic analysis of the house yielded more clues. Fingerprints on the bathroom faucet matched Christian's, as expected, but the lack of any defensive wounds on Margaret's body suggested she had been unconscious when she drowned. Rowland's autopsy report indicated that Margaret had likely been sedated or incapacitated before being placed in the tub. This finding led Wallace to examine Christian's medication more closely. Had he used his own prescription drugs to sedate his grandmother? Interviews with Christian's therapist, Dr. Evelyn Martz, provided further insight into his mental state. Dr. Martz had been treating Christian for several years, working with him through his parents' divorce and his increasingly unstable emotions. She described Christian as someone who struggled deeply with feelings of abandonment and isolation, particularly after his parents' separation.
He always had this need for control,
Dr. Martz explained.
When he felt like he was losing control, whether over his life, his relationships, or even his emotions, he'd lash out. Not violently, at first, but emotionally. He became possessive of people, especially his grandmother. She was the one person in his life who hadn't left him.
Dr. Martz's analysis painted a chilling picture of Christian's emotional dependency on Margaret. His mental instability, combined with his growing obsession with keeping her close, had likely played a role in what had transpired that fatal night. But still, Wallace needed more concrete evidence to fully understand the motive and sequence of events. Despite the mounting evidence against Christian, Wallace remained cautious. She knew better than to jump to conclusions without all the facts, and there were still some inconsistencies that bothered her. For one, the scattered state of the house didn't align perfectly with Christian's otherwise quiet and controlled nature. If he had been the one to kill his grandmother, why had the house been left in such disarray? Then there was the matter of the anonymous tip that had been phoned in shortly after Margaret's death. The caller, who refused to identify themselves, claimed that Margaret had been involved in a conflict with a local contractor, Frank Davidson, over a series of home renovations that had gone wrong. According to the tip, Davidson had become increasingly angry with Margaret in the weeks leading up to her death, even making threats against her. Wallace tracked down Davidson, questioning him about his interactions with Margaret. While he admitted to having disagreements with her overpayment and timelines for the renovation work, he vehemently denied any involvement in her death. Davidson's alibi checked out. He had been out of town on the day Margaret died. Still, the tip had thrown a wrench into Wallace's investigation, and she couldn't completely rule out the possibility of outside involvement. Additionally, a forensic review of the scattered objects in the house revealed no clear signs of a break-in, but Wallace couldn't ignore the possibility that someone else could have been in the house that night. Was it possible that Christian, in his unstable state, had allowed someone into the home, either intentionally or unintentionally? Or had the scene been staged to confuse investigators? As Wallace continued to dig into Christian's life, more troubling details about his mental state emerged. Interviews with former teachers and friends, those who had drifted away from Christian as his behavior became more erratic, revealed a pattern of increasing isolation, paranoia, and emotional instability. One former classmate mentioned that Christian had always been a quiet, introspective boy, but over the years, his personality had shifted. He had become unpredictable, at times expressing intense emotions with little provocation. Further probing into Christian's school records revealed several incidents where he had lashed out in seemingly irrational ways, particularly when he felt that his routine or sense of control was threatened. In one instance, he had an emotional breakdown when his class schedule was changed without warning. In another, He had been sent home after an outburst in which he accused a teacher of conspiring against him. These incidents, while alarming, had been attributed to his difficult home life and were never addressed beyond surface-level interventions. Detective Wallace also discovered that in the weeks leading up to Margaret's death, Christian had stopped attending therapy sessions with Dr. Evelyn Marks altogether. Dr. Marks had tried to reach out to him several times, but Christian had refused to engage, leaving her deeply concerned about his deteriorating condition. Christian's refusal to take his medication regularly, as evidenced by the scattered pills found in the house, only compounded the problem. The drugs prescribed to him were essential to managing his mood swings and erratic behavior, and without them, his mental state would have been increasingly fragile. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Wallace found herself increasingly focused on Christian as the prime suspect in Margaret's death. The physical evidence, the fingerprints, the lack of defensive wounds, and the forensic analysis pointing to sedation, combined with Christian's erratic behavior and mental health issues, painted a disturbing picture. But Wallace wasn't ready to make any arrests yet. She knew that there were still elements of the case that needed to be clarified. The question of whether Christian had acted alone, or if there was someone else involved, lingered in her mind. The disarray in the house suggested a struggle, yet Christian's fragile emotional state made it difficult to determine whether the scene had been staged or if there had been another participant in the events leading up to Margaret's death. When Christian was brought in for questioning, his demeanor only added to Wallace's suspicions. He appeared distant, his responses fragmented and inconsistent. At times, he seemed confused, genuinely unsure of what had happened. He denied having any involvement in his grandmother's death, insisting that he had found her that morning, lifeless in a tub, with no understanding of how it had happened. However, Christian's account of the timeline was riddled with gaps. He couldn't explain why he had waited hours to call 911, nor could he provide a coherent explanation for the state of the house. His insistence that Margaret's death was a tragic accident didn't align with the evidence gathered so far, and his inability to account for his own actions during that critical time only deepened Wallace's suspicions. Psychological evaluations conducted during his detainment revealed a young man teetering on the edge of a breakdown. Christian was diagnosed with severe personality disorders, including elements of obsessive-compulsive tendencies and delusions. His obsession with Margaret had grown to unhealthy levels, and his need to control her, combined with his declining mental state, had likely driven him to an extreme. Still, there were nagging doubts that kept Wallace from fully closing in on Christian as the sole culprit. The case had several loose ends that hadn't been tied up, particularly the possibility of external involvement. The anonymous tip regarding the contractor, while not directly implicating anyone, still raised questions about whether Margaret had been in conflict with others, which could have potentially played a role in her death. Wallace also considered whether Christian's mental instability could have led him to inadvertently create a scene that was more chaotic than it actually was. Could the disarray in the house have been a result of his breakdown after discovering Margaret's body? Was it possible that Christian had not intended to kill his grandmother, but his need for control, coupled with his psychological disorder, had led to a tragic accident? As Wallace reviewed the evidence, she knew that the climax of the case was drawing near. The forensic evidence, psychological assessments, and witness testimonies all pointed to Christian being at the center of the tragedy. But without a clear confession or solid motive beyond his fragile mental state, Wallace wasn't ready to make an arrest. She needed something more, something that would definitively connect Christian's actions to the crime. With the investigation reaching a critical point, Wallace began to focus on the remaining pieces of evidence that might shed light on Christian's involvement. The scattered pills, the signs of sedation, and the prescription bottle became key elements of her case. Could Christian have used his medication to sedate Margaret, not fully understanding the consequences of his actions? Wallace also re-examined the timelines provided by Christian's parents, neighbors, and the forensic team. The sequence of events that led to Margaret's death was becoming clearer, but the exact moment when things went wrong remained elusive. What had triggered Christian to act? Was it a moment of frustration, a breakdown, or a calculated attempt to control his grandmother? As the final pieces of evidence were gathered, Wallace prepared for what would come next. The interrogation of Christian, while not providing a clear confession, had revealed enough about his mental state to confirm that he had been spiraling for some time. His inability to differentiate between care and control, love and obsession, had likely played a significant role in Margaret's death. But as Wallace would soon learn, the truth of what happened that night would be more complicated than she had anticipated. In the days following Christian's interrogation, Wallace received the final pieces of forensic analysis that would change the direction of the investigation. The toxicology report on Margaret Randall revealed traces of a powerful sedative in her system, one that matched the prescription medication found in Christian's possession. This confirmed Wallace's earlier suspicion: Margaret had been drugged before her death. But the levels of the sedative were far higher than what would have been prescribed for Christian, indicating that she had been given an overdose, rendering her completely unconscious. Wallace now had the means. Christian had used his own medication to incapacitate his grandmother. The question remained: had he done this intentionally to harm her, or had his fragile mental state driven him to act in a way he didn't fully understand? Determined to find answers, Wallace revisited the timeline of events. She reviewed the security footage from a nearby street camera, which captured Christian leaving the house late the night before Margaret's body was discovered. His destination was a local pharmacy, where he had attempted to refill his prescription. The pharmacist, however, had refused, citing that it was too soon for a refill. Christian had left the store visibly agitated. This small but crucial detail added weight to the theory that Christian's erratic behavior in the hours leading up to Margaret's death was tied to his deteriorating mental state and reliance on the medication. Wallace also combed through Christian's personal effects once more. In his bedroom, among the scattered notebooks filled with incoherent ramblings, she found something chilling: a detailed entry written just days before the incident. In the entry, Christian expressed his growing frustration with his grandmother. He wrote about feeling suffocated by her care, unable to escape the control he believed she held over him. But the most disturbing part was his final line: "If I can't be free, neither can she." This revelation sent a shock through Wallace's mind. It was clear that Christian's love for Margaret had twisted into something far darker: a need to dominate her, to prevent her from leaving him, as he feared everyone else in his life had. The words in his notebook reflected the mind of a deeply disturbed young man who had lost his grip on reality. Wallace returned to Christian for a final interrogation, this time armed with the new evidence. As she laid out the findings, the toxicology report, the security footage, the journaled entry, Christian's demeanor changed. He became agitated, muttering to himself, his hands shaking. When Wallace pressed him on the events of that night, asking if he had drugged his grandmother to keep her from leaving him, Christian finally broke. Tears welled in his eyes as he confessed to giving Margaret the medication, but in his mind, it wasn't to harm her, it was to keep her safe, to protect her from the world. He claimed that he had seen her slipping away, and believed that by sedating her, he could keep her close. Christian's fragile mental state had clouded his ability to see the consequences of his actions. He insisted that he hadn't meant to kill her, that he only wanted her to stay with him forever. But when Margaret became unresponsive, Christian panicked. He placed her in the bathtub, hoping the water would wake her up. When it didn't, he froze, unable to process what he had done. Wallace listened carefully, piecing together the final moments of Margaret's life. Christian's actions, driven by his delusions and obsessive need for control, had led to a tragic and fatal outcome. He had drugged his grandmother with the intention of keeping her by his side, but his inability to comprehend the dangers of his actions resulted in her drowning. In his confession, Christian revealed another heartbreaking detail: after discovering that Margaret had died, he couldn't bring himself to call 911. He sat in the house for hours, paralyzed by guilt and fear, unable to face the reality of what he had done. The disarray in the house was a result of his frantic attempt to fix the situation, moving furniture and items in a state of confusion, before eventually making the call. With Christian's confession, the case had reached its conclusion. Margaret Randall had been killed, not out of malice or premeditated violence, but as a result of her grandson's deep psychological instability. His love for her had turned into a suffocating obsession, and his mental illness had warped his perception of reality to the point where he believed that drugging her would save her. In the months that followed, Christian was placed under psychiatric evaluation to determine his fitness for trial. His deteriorating mental state and the evidence of his long struggle with untreated personality disorders played a significant role in his defense. The courtroom was filled with tension as the details of Christian's actions were laid bare. The prosecution painted a picture of a young man overwhelmed by his psychological demons, and while the death of Margaret Randall was a tragic accident, it was one that could not go unpunished. Ultimately, the court ruled that Christian was not fully responsible for his actions due to his severe mental illness. He was sentenced to a secure psychiatric facility, where he would undergo long-term treatment rather than serve time in a traditional prison. The judge's decision reflected the complexity of the case, one that straddled the line between criminal intent and psychological breakdown. For the Randall family, the trial's outcome brought some measure of closure, but the tragedy of Margaret's death would leave a lasting impact on all those involved. Margaret Randall had been a beacon of kindness and stability, and her life had ended not by the hands of a violent criminal, but by the fragile mind of someone she loved and tried to protect. As Christian began his treatment, the neighborhood of Mesa, Arizona, slowly returned to its quiet routine, but the memory of what had happened in the Randall home would linger for years to come. Thank you for watching this episode of True Crime Hidden Files. If you found this case as compelling as we did, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and hit the notification bell for more gripping true crime stories. Stay safe, and see you next time.